David Bailey, how's it going?
Hey, doing well, man. Doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Trying to stay cool in this Tennessee heat. You know,
I know that's right.
You guys are probably pretty hot in Richmond too, huh?
Yeah, Richmond, Virginia has that mid-Atlantic humidity, so.
We're waiting for this fall weather, right?
Right.
Yeah, so how does one become David Bailey? How do you get into the work of reconciliation?
Yeah, so I've been born and raised in Richmond. Literally, what I learned in Richmond was taking me around the country and the world. Literally just got back from South Africa, just teaching folks about some of the things I learned in Richmond. And a little bit about my story is that my parents came like really dedicated to faith a little bit later on in life in their 30s. And my dad really got involved in urban ministry and would do, even though we grew up in the suburbs, kind of in the first place where minorities would kind of move when they would leave the city. We went to church in the urban inner city, like, and literally in some housing projects is where we went to church.
Okay.
And so I grew up with people of diverse backgrounds, people who had more money than me, people had less money than me. But, you know, when you're a kid, you just kind of basically say, hey, do people treat me right or not? And you aren't really thinking about those things. And I didn't know till I was in college that wasn't most people's experience. Most people live with people who have the same kind of economic status as they do, and that wasn't my story. So later on, I was into music. I started playing music really young. I started to play piano at the church at 11 years old, and I was the minister of music at 18, and then, you know, when you're a musician playing gigs, you play at country clubs, and then I would play at the jazz clubs for middle upper class black folks, and then I would play at my church is a Black Pentecostal church, but then I would play a Presbyterian or Assemblies of God, predominantly white churches, for 9-11 o'clock service, and then there was an evening service on Sunday evening. I would play for international folks who just recently moved to Richmond, and it was led by a pastor that was from India.
Okay,
and so that was kind of my college work life. I would kind of play Friday through Saturday all around the city, and I would engage with people of different ethnicities. Everybody was kind of their own silos, and being a person that grew up with people of different economic, education levels, different ethnicities, a lot of times people talk about those people, and they couldn't really name those people by name. Like, I knew Jeff, I knew Joshine, I knew Bob, I knew, Nikki, and they all had a specific name. And I was like, hey, if you knew this person knew that person, kind of the areas where y'all could actually be a blessing to one another. And so that came to be a heartbeat behind my ministry. Being a producer, a music director, you're a cultural anthropologist. And so I was like, you know, it's a natural thing. And then I started teaching people how to do something that was kind of natural to me because of my vocation. And so that's kind of how I got into this work.
That's good. So for our listeners, break down, what do you mean by cultural anthropologists?
Cultural anthropology is a specific cut of the study of humanity and like looking at how they make sense of the world, what they make of the world. And so when you're a music producer, you need to understand, like, for example, if I'm playing jazz music or if I'm at the country club and, you know, I have to kind of get people dancing and, this kind of predominantly white, wealthy folks. And then I'm at this Pentecostal church is probably that the one I was at was pretty economically poor, and they were African American. The thing that would move their heart would be very different. The thing that would kind of move their bodies would be very different. So in many ways, you have to kind of study that, knowing kind of the values that's going on in the culture, the aesthetics that's going on in the culture, and to be able to communicate in that kind of way. Like, a lot of pastors and people in ministry don't think along that way. They say, hey, I'm just going to be faithful, preach the word. I'm going to just the mission, and not really realize that you can't do it in a culturally neutral way. But you're always crossing some kind of boundary. Right.
Yeah, I think some of the people that are best able to cross those boundaries have to have some exposure to the anthropologies. I know, Lecrae has labeled himself, I think, a social anthropologist, and Billy Graham, I believe his major was anthropology. And a lot of people attribute the reason why he took the stance as early as he did on needing to desegregate. He wavered a little bit on it, but a lot of people attribute that to a study of anthropology.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. So with this field, and I'll just dive right into this because here at Praise Hands, we're all about creative cross-cultural Christianity. And specifically, one of our major goals is to desegregate the music of the church. And if we're looking at things anthropologically, if we're trying to kind of, maybe you mentioned going to these different demographics, seeing what moves them, seeing really what's below the cultural iceberg, the values that they hold, and what's going to really speak their heart language in their heart music. Yeah. How can the church use this powerful tool of music to be bringing the church and bring people together instead of pushing them apart?
So I think it's important to understand a couple of things. I think much of our modern culture of music has been shaped by marketplace dynamics.
Right.
And so, and not even just like picking on the last 40 years of contemporary Christian worship music. I mean, even hymnody, over the last 400 years was made possible through the publishing industry. And so you had to publish things that made sense, that you could make a return on your investment, and creating hymnals.
Right.
And depending on, you had to like tailor that towards whatever denomination, whether it was Catholic or Baptist or Presbyterian or Methodist. And so, all that's very market driven. And then, when you had the Jesus movement that eventually created the contemporary worship movement, that created a whole industry, and that's all market driven. So for the most part, it's like there's an industry that's marketed towards the white suburban aesthetic. And then because there's a pretty decent black African American perspective, there's like a gospel music market that's traditional contemporary. And because now there's starting to be more economic demand for Hispanic folks, people see the economic opportunity and are engaging in that way. Now, the thing is that I think there's a double-edged sword on that dynamic. I think there's some good parts about it.
Sure.
I could probably go to your church and be able to sing "How Great Is Our God" or "How Great Thou Art." I think the other side of that is that the whole like local context, what God is saying and speaking to a particular people at a particular time in a particular place, that is lost and missed a lot. And what's best for the marketplace always might not necessarily be what's best for the local church in that time and place.
Yeah.
And so, we basically realized that we were doing ministry here in an urban inner city context where there's economic diversity, different people, different stages of life, certain kinds of trauma experiences, and we just didn't have worship that was expressing that. Also didn't express a lot of worship is very vertical and not even that Trinitarian.
Sure.
If you kind of look at our lyrics, it's about the Father and Jesus, and we are trying to have some stuff that's both Trinitarian and horizontal as well as vertical, that deals with kind of our relationships with God, one another, the earth, all of it.
Yeah, no, that's so good. So given your passion for all these things and your background translated today, you started a group called Arabon.
Yeah, so I started this ministry called Arabon. Arabon is a Greek word. The way it's used in the New Testament, it's a Greek word that means a foretaste of things to come. The way it's used in the New Testament is that the Holy Spirit is given to the church as a foretaste of the heaven that's to come. Well, the world doesn't get the Holy Spirit. What the world gets is a foretaste of things to come is the church. And so in many ways, we're like a try before you buy policy for people who don't know Jesus, And what our ministry tries to do is to help people, help Christian leaders and their communities to become reconciling communities, a foretaste of what happens to come. So I came into this through a music background. I actually stopped performing music in 2015. And so we have a particular branch of our ministry that still does the worship and music side of things. But what we spend a lot of time doing as an organization is thinking through both training resources, communication resources to help Christian leaders in their communities, and how to practically become a reconciling community. And so our five-step processes help people see reconciliation and spiritual formation, help increase the cultural intelligence of the community. 3, help people to learn a diverse shared narrative We can have the same set of events happen, but have different experiences of those events based off our demographics. The fourth piece is how do you participate in cross-cultural collaboration? And then the fifth dynamic is help people to engage in reconciling culture making.
Yeah.
And so we're constantly helping folks engage through those sort of things.
That's amazing. So I want to key in on one of those, in particular, the narrative. I think is so huge because everybody has their own lens, and what they see determines their world really. So how practically can we encourage people in our communities to develop a shared narrative, and what are some steps that you've seen be successful towards that?
We oftentimes want to jump to the shared narrative piece. And I think there's two really significant foundational steps. One is to understand reconciliation as spiritual formation. If I'm in a secular space, I say reconciliation is a basic human need.
Sure.
We can't move through life without it.
Yeah.
And it's really the thing that actually helps us to be more and more like the likeness of Christ when we engage in a work of reconciliation. So that's one key foundation. The second foundation is engaging a little bit of cultural intelligence. And what that means is that, we're shaped in different ways. And everybody says, hey, I'm an individual. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people say I'm an individual.
Right.
And I'm like, no, you've been influenced just like everybody's been influenced. And there's things that make sense to you.
Right.
That, but not because you just decided to make sense to you. It's because in your culture that makes sense, but with the people that you're around.
Right.
And so helping understand that that's true of other folks and different people, and everybody has it, is really, really key. So then it's not surprising when you hear that, like, you learn about different narratives, that, oh, wow, I didn't know things were done that way in Franklin, Tennessee. I know it was done that way in Richmond. Or, oh, this makes sense why you think that way versus, I had a very different experience. So I think about this thing in a different way.
Yeah.
And so those are things that you want to kind of really help people to see and give folks the tools to be able to handle and lean into different narratives that folks might have.
Yeah, that's really good. And I know one of the prime expressions for you guys is this ministry and this group called Urban Doxology. You guys have done songs on YouTube that are really amazing. Tell us a little bit about why this project was started and what you see it doing to make an impact now.
Yeah, so, there were two things. If you kind of think about our 5-step process, the first three, spiritual formation, cultural intelligence, and diverse shared narratives, that's all about shared knowledge and language. Like, a lot of times people want to just have better conversations,
right?
But eventually you have to do something,
right? Yeah.
And here we were, I was part of this church planting team called, and the church has become Easton Fellowship, and we realized, okay, we don't have the tools ourselves as leaders, but nor are we giving people the tools to be more effective in this work. And we say we'll be about reconciliation. We haven't really been equipping folks in that way. But then I also realized that we're here today because of the culture that was made yesterday. So if we're dissatisfied with what's going on today, we need to create a new culture for tomorrow.
Right.
So engaging in actual active culture making is really, really important.
Yeah.
And so I saw that there wasn't a lot of leadership development pipelines in our community for people of color and women. There were natural leadership development pipelines for white men, and you would invite women or people of color in, but it was kind of more like they had to kind of be able to assimilate within a dominant culture.
Sure.
Versus creating a program that was specifically for them to know, okay, this is how you engage in dominant culture. The second thing I realized was that we were kind of negotiating contemporary worship music and hymns, and then same thing with contemporary gospel and traditional gospel. But we're in this urban community, and we didn't have the language of like Black Lives Matter back then. But I realized that folks in urban communities aren't going to church like they did 30, 40 years ago. So gospel music, and even Israel Houghton at the time, was as foreign as it was to white people as it was to urban inner city youth. And so being an anthropologist and looking at our community, I said, you know what? Let's try to figure out what this worship sound like in the urban context for our community. And that's what the Urban Doxology Project started. So we started this Urban Doxology songwriting internship where we got young people between the ages of 18 to 25 study theology, justice, reconciliation, And instead of writing papers, what they do is they write worship songs.
Mm-hmm.
And those worship songs become what we sing in our congregation.
That's amazing. That's so good. So one of the things that you mentioned is this concept of, a dominant culture and the need to assimilate in some cases to be able to fit in. For people that are in that dominant culture, obviously there's nothing wrong with being white, nothing wrong with being male, but people that find themselves in that demographic, how do you explain to them this concept of a dominant culture when a lot of times from when you've been in it and it's normal, it just feels like life?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the deal of it is, and it goes back to like the third step of understanding diverse shared narratives. Mm-hmm. I just think like part of the reason why it feels normal is because that's probably the only story that one has heard. Or if they heard the story, they like the real story is this, and then here's the subsidized story. So it's kind of like when we look at history, right? Mm-hmm. The way we're taught history in school is the real history is what Europeans have done and the contribution to Western society.
Right.
Rarely did we ever hear or learn about Eastern society. Like we could go a whole 12 years,
right,
and learn about like Eastern society and not learn much about Western society. But generally speaking, people in the East have to learn about the West,
right,
because of like globalization. But it's not the other way around. We tend to learn about Europeans' contribution to America, not like the Chinese brothers and sisters, the Hispanic brothers and sisters, the African American brothers and sisters, and the Jewish folks. I mean, like we don't get a chance to hear how these different contributions. And so when you realize, like, oh man, this is just one way. Like my way is one way of a million ways. My story is one story of a million stories. It helps you to not actually have an inflated view of oneself.
Yeah.
And so that's the one thing that I really just encourage people to do, is to read and get into stories of diverse people groups.
Yeah, that's amazing. So let's say you've got somebody that graduates from your internship program with Urban Doxology. They go to Richmond, Virginia, have the time of their life, and they land a job at a church somewhere. How can an individual like that help lead their church and really the church in a way that promotes reconciliation and cultural healing right where they're at?
Yes, I mean, that's really what a lot of them do. A lot of them graduate and end up, a lot of them are pastors now, missionaries. Mm-hmm. We've graduated over 55 interns.
Wow.
Last 9 years. And this year coming up is going to be our 10th year.
How cool.
And so they're doing that. And I think a lot of it's like listening and seeing what's the story, what God's doing in that community already. Mm-hmm. Taking a survey of who's in the church and who's in the community. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times people drive in a 15 to 30 mile radius. And so you really should look at the whole radius and not the etching of the radius.
Sure.
And we say, hey, do that. And then what you want to do is prepare as if somebody's going to be there. Like, if I invited you to my house for dinner and I say, hey, come at 7:30. And then, you ring in the doorbell and I don't have any food prepared for you. I don't have any placement. It's just like, you're like, oh, did you really want me here? Like, am I imposing? Like, and oftentimes that's the way it is with whatever the dominant culture is of that church. That's oftentimes what it's like when a minority comes into the community. People aren't prepared for them. There's no sense of hospitality. Like, of course, like all is welcome, but you haven't really done anything to show that folks are welcome.
Sure.
So that's a really key piece. I think so. Some of how you want to do that is by looking at demographics in your community. See how these demographics, how do these people groups worship in general, and then engage from there.
Yeah. So looking at your city, Richmond, Virginia, it's got a history.
Yeah, it does.
Significant history, and that's drawn upon racial lines dating back to 1619 and even before that. What are some key moments in Virginia history that you see needing to be redeemed, and how are you going about redeeming these in your city?
I mean, one of the things you probably hear me say often is there's a friend of mine in the city, a pastor in the city named Ben Campbell, and he prayed that Richmond will no longer be known as the capital of Confederacy, but known as the capital of reconciliation.
Mm.
So we're trying to like own our narrative and see how can God redeem that. I think if you kind of like try to forget and not kind of like confess it and see what God could do in a different way, I think that's one thing that we really endeavor to do, is to become the capital of reconciliation.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, I think what that looks like is, I think, being intentional across different lines. I mean, there's different fault lines in the city. I think there's just different people live different, like in certain places across the city. You know, there's been like a white flight that's happened, and those white churches that left, I mean, a lot of them are economically prosperous. It could be because God blessed them, but also it's most likely, I mean, a significant part into that, I would say it, is the fact that, you know, when you move to the wealthier zip code, as long as you respond to the consumer needs of the people, then you can grow a church, you know. And so that might sound really harsh, and I'm not saying that gospel isn't being preached there. I'm not saying anything of that nature, but they're on the poorer zip codes, they're preaching the gospel there too. But like the economics doesn't work out the same kind of way, and that's a real factor. And so I think sometimes we over spiritualize stuff. And so really, I think a thing that I really try to do is get the churches planted in the wealthy zip codes and the ones in the poor zip codes actually work together in mutuality with one another. Right. Actually bring a lot of redemption and reconciliation. Yeah.
So one of the problems that I see with how our church structures are laid out, let's say in a given city, and this is indicative of capitalism in general, is the more similar you are to another product that's being offered, the more you see them as competition, and the less you are incentivized to collaborate with them. So in the same way, you kind of have the, I think it's the unwritten like 60-mile rule, where if a church plants within 60 miles, it's like, hey, you're kind of in our turf. But if they go 60 miles away, you're like, okay, you're good. And looking not just in Richmond, but other cities in the United States, how do we transform our local church body in a given city to, rather than see each other as competition, to truly be incentivized to work together in a sustainable way?
Yeah, that's great. Well, you know, one thing that's really great about Richmond is that I can generally say there's a spirit of collaboration. Folks don't have that. And that's really to people who've come, I mean, over the last 40 years, it was like my dad's generation, and then my pastor mentor, and then me and my generation. And I'm just hoping the folks that I'm discipling are passing on the spirit of collaboration. I really do think it's of the devil to be territorial in the kingdom. I don't understand that. I just think that's, I mean, the disciples tried that foolishness, and he was like, yo, man, people are casting out demons and they're doing the work that we were doing. He said to Jesus. Jesus was like, we're all on the same team, you know? I really don't have time for that. I mean, that's just so foolish to me. Right. And it's really about building somebody's like a little K kingdom versus the big kingdom. Right. So for me, I'm gonna always try to practice generosity. If I feel like at the end of the day, if I know that I practice generosity with a Christian brother and sister, then I sleep better at nighttime. Like, and it's God's work anyway. So I just think that's the core of what has to happen. People have to realize you're working for God. It's God's word. Right. You know, I think there's ways to honor one another. I think definitely, you know, I'm like, hey, before I go and start something new, can I help what you're already doing? But we kind of I think you can honor one another in that way. But if it just seems like, oh man, it doesn't seem like it makes sense. Yeah. After we've spent some time discerning, then like, let's bless each other on our way. Yeah. So you are on the board for Q, which is an organization that I love. I go to the conference every year, and it's such a powerful movement to respond in a proactive way to a lot of cultural issues instead of a reactive way. I would imagine in your work as a reconciler, you do find yourself in spaces, say, of a white majority in white evangelical spaces. What advice would you give to people of color that are trying to retain their cultural identity, but also be a bridge in some of these scenarios? Yeah, I mean, I think part of it's my calling. I mean, everybody's not called to do the same thing. Right. I mean, this relationship with Gabe Lyons started in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of help him. And this is in his book, Good Faith. And I'm not, I don't think I'm not speaking out of turn about anything, but, we met in 2014 at the Q in 2014. He made some major faux pas from the stage, and I just tell he just didn't know. He was just ignorant. And so and when I use the word ignorant, I'm ignorant about a lot of stuff. Like, it's okay to not know stuff.
Right.
And so instead of like throwing a bus talking about him, I was just like, I went up to him and said, "Hey, man," I saw his heart. I saw he was trying.
Right.
I said, "Hey, man, I do this kind of work. Give me a call if you need to." He was praying. He called me. Shortly after that, we talked a little bit. He was like, "Oh, wow, this is more than I was thinking." Then Ferguson happened, and then he called me about that because people were looking at him for leaders. And a lot of times people look for the people in the community for leadership, and he knew that he wasn't qualified in the area, so he gave me a call, and I talked to him and kind of helped coach some stuff, did some consulting in 2015 with his organization, and spoke at the Q in 2015, talked about implicit racial bias. That was a concept that was new to him, and that was a blessing to him, But then 4 years later, the way the Q conference has been curated, like for me, and even early on, I told Gabe, I said, "Gabe, the goal I don't think can be how diverse can Q be because of what it is, by the nature of what it is, how it's been curated. If you went and made this like a diverse space and that became the goal, then a lot's going to change, I think, in ways that might not be helpful for the organization. I mean, like, it just might change its mission in that way."
Sure.
But the question to be, every community can't be a diverse community, but every Christian community ought to be a reconciling community. So I think the thing is for Q to be like, hey, how can we be a reconciling community? And so I do think, yes, there are more diverse voices than have been before. It is like moving the Titanic, but it's a different question. Like, there are conversations that Gabe can have that really help shepherd and pastor the folks in the Q community that is kind of helping it to shift a lot, and everybody doesn't have the patience for that. Everybody's not called to work with folks in that way and explain things. So I don't put that on all minorities, So I think understand where your grace is. I do think we have to be patient with all of us in general, but some people just don't have the time and patience for that, and there's other people that do other things in this work that I don't have the grace for. So my big advice is to say, like, everybody that's a Christian ought to be asking the question, how do we become a reconciling community? What is my piece of the reconciliation puzzle? And if you can answer that, then who am I to judge what you're doing?
Yeah, because everybody's got their lane. Everybody's positioned in a different spot for a different reason, with different giftings for different reasons. Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
Looking forward, a stat that is about to change, churches are slowly but surely getting less segregated. I think we're about to hit the 20% mark. That 20% of churches are desegregated, which would be defined sociologically as less than 80% of one dominant race or culture. What encourages you when you look at the church moving forward and in the topic of reconciliation?
Yeah, this might sound a little strange, but I think if you understand what I'm saying, like, for me, my goal isn't to make sure that every church is at least 20% diverse. Because even when you look at even diverse churches, they might be diverse in color, but not diverse in culture.
Sure.
It still might be operating under the golden rule. He or she that has the goal makes the rules. And that can sometimes be more painful than people being separated. And my goal is to help folks be reconciling communities. You could be a dominant culture, multicolored church, or you could be everybody looks the same culture. They could be from dominant culture. They could even be really wealthy, but they said like, hey, I realize how broken our country is because of the history of racism. And so what we're going to do is we're going to be in Malibu. It's a church in Malibu. Malibu is not like whatever church is in Malibu is not going to be so diverse. And so, and there's a reason for it. The city, this is beyond our none of us are responsible for the reason why Malibu is not going to be so diverse. And so for folks to be like, hey, what is it like? We're going to own some stuff in the reconciliation space. We're going to do some partnerships. We're going to allow our souls to be transformed by having more diverse voices speaking into what we're doing. Even though we can't become more diverse in our membership, but we're going to allow the Spirit of God through our diverse Christian brothers and sisters to transform us, and we're going to change the way that we work and the way that we live and what we do, and become more of a reconciling community. And so for me, that's what my goals are, you know. And I think I hear more people trying to have that kind of conversation. I do think when you go after reconciliation, I think diversity can come. But if you go after diversity, I don't know if reconciliation always comes.
That's really profound. So if you're talking to a leader that really cares about these topics, what's one mistake that you don't want them to make?
I think reconciliation and spiritual formation is the beginning and the end. You know, I really think the more that we're transformed in the likeness of Christ, you can't go wrong with this, because the Spirit of God is going to lead you to relationships and things that will transform you and insights that you just couldn't imagine. I mean, where I am today, I couldn't imagine that 11 years ago when we started this. I had no idea. I mean, matter of fact, in my early days, in 2008, I was conflating diversity and reconciliation. And I realized that diversity doesn't guarantee you reconciliation. It guarantees you conflict, but it doesn't guarantee you reconciliation. And then I have just been so transformed by pursuing the ministry of reconciliation, the way I practice with people when something goes wrong and there's a conflict, for me to lean towards reconciliation. And I've also been transformed by the diverse relationships that I've had, you know? So I do think spiritual transformation is the beginning and the end. It's the through, it's the process, it's the means. But I hope nobody hears that and says that you can't do anything. Like that you just say, I'm just trying to be spiritually transformed, and you don't actually do anything to make any kind of change in your community. That should never be interpreted that way. You can't be transformed if you're not actually involved in engaging in doing something, taking action.
Sure. How do you think, looking at the life of Jesus, how do you see him providing the example and making this issue of reconciliation something that's really fundamental to the Christian faith?
Well, I mean, I think one is Philippians 2. I mean, Jesus, who's God, the most privileged being in existence, took on a form of lowliness. So I think one is you got to go low. I don't in any kind of reconciliation effort that doesn't require us to go low, it's probably not a reconciliation level effort. I mean, even as a person, if you're part of marginalized culture, that I do believe that there's a ascent that God has, and I think people in the valley rise and people in the mountain go low. That's kind of a dominant theme throughout Scripture. I mean, there's just a mindset of Christ of servanthood, and there's a mindset of death and resurrection that's just a part of what it means to be a Christian, to really trust what God's doing in our lives, you know. And so that's one thing I think everybody has to do that. And it's easier for people from the margins to go lower than people who are in the center. It's easier for women to serve than it is for men. And so a lot of times it's easier for minorities to people of color to kind of go low towards white people, and it's harder for white people to do the other way around. That's just what the nature of it is, of being part of dominant culture. And so a lot of times you have to have consciousness. But just because you've been part of margins, and just because you aren't a part of dominant culture, doesn't give you an excuse not to be a Christian and to do Philippians 2. And somehow, in this mysterious way of the way the gospel works, the way the Holy Spirit works, even if the other person is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, but you do what God's telling you to do, somehow God works with all of that. And I mean, it's the most profound thing. So I think Jesus gave us that model. I think a lot of times we look for power, for change, you know. And I just told you I'm on the board of Q, and it's a very Kuyperian way of approaching the world and dealing with influencers and shaping influencers. I think Gabe has that. He has that grace in his life, while at the same time most change in culture has come from the margins,
Sure.
Um, it's not a comprehension. So I'm kind of a little bit more Anabaptist. I mean, this is kind of where Anabaptists have like a suspicion of power,
right?
And kind of
detachment of church and state.
Yeah. And so I kind of like this. This is kind of where I'm like, if it's slavery time, then the Anabaptists are the ones that are going to come through for you because they're going to supply the Underground Railroad. They're going to like fight against the system. And I think that's kind of a little bit of I think that's the healthy disposition of the church in general. But when it's 1863 and it's time to make a vote, I need a Kuyperian in there to make a vote. To be in that place to vote to stop all the foolishness.
What was that word that you said? Kuyperian?
Kuyperian, yeah. That's Abraham Kuyper.
Oh, okay, got it.
He has this like
seven spheres.
Yeah, 7 spheres of influence, and he says that well, there were people who took on that concept of the 7 spheres of influence, but it's just every inch of the earth, like God's reach and lordship is at every inch of the earth. Yeah. And so the idea that you have Christians in all areas, and I'm in agreement for that. I feel like that's so in David Bailey's perfect world, and I say that tongue in cheek. I would say like 70% of our energy would be like the church engaging in the Anabaptist faithful presence. I think 20% of our work should be discipling people in kind of their Kuyperian vocational call. And then I think 10% of the time, there might be a time where we need to be a witness, be a prophetic or pastoral witness to the world, kind of like what Dr. King did, he ended up being a kind of witness out of his theological conviction, but he started really at an Anabaptist type of
suffering servant,
and really pastorally taking care of his people. He wasn't like, I'm going to try to do something great. He was just a young kid on the block. He was the newest pastor. He had the least amount to lose. They pushed him out there. He got in front of TV. He was a nice looking guy. He was a young guy that understood the way television worked. And God was the one that made him to be this like significant like influencer to really change society as a whole. But that wasn't his goal at the very beginning. And so I'm always encouraging people to like try to serve a small group of people. Like even though I have a national platform at this point in my life, I'm still a local church dude. Like I just literally just been trying to serve my local community. Kind of 1.5 mile radius with a group of, at the time we started with like 100 people. It's not, now it's maybe like 300 people, but it's not a huge thing, and God's opened up doors. So I just want to encourage people, like whatever your piece of the reconciliation puzzle is, try to steward that well, be a great gardener there, and then see what God does with the increase.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this, David. How can people learn more about Arrabon, Urban Doxology, and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I would encourage people. We have a study series called Race, Class, and the Kingdom of God. You can get to it at arrabon.com, and then urbandoxology.com. There's going to be a new album coming out in 2020 for Urban Doxology. It's called Meet With Me, and the theme is it's on communion, looking through the lens of justice and reconciliation. So
amazing.
Yeah.
Looking forward to hearing it. Well, thank you so much, David. God bless you and all that you're doing in Richmond and beyond.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Man, I just feel so honored to get to learn from these giants like David who have been pioneering things for years, and we get to be the ones to benefit from the years and years of work that they've already sown in. So thank you, David, and all the other people that have been on this podcast. If you're listening to this podcast today, it's important that you know that here at Praise Hands, this podcast is really just the tip of the iceberg. We've got a growing volunteer team, including our media team, our operations team, and our digital street team. But one of the things I'm most excited about right now is our monthly support team. All monthly donors receive access to an exclusive recurring video call where we talk through current events, previous episodes, and also get your feedback on future guests and episode topics. But more than that, you'll also receive access to exclusive content from many of our video guests. In some cases, it may be unreleased footage of other things we talked about. It may be a tour of a church or a business that's dramatically impacting its community, things you won't find anywhere else. Again, if you'd like more information on this monthly support team, visit praisehands.com/donate. We so appreciate you not only being a listener, but being a part of this community. Thanks for tuning in, Praise Hands. We'll see you next week.